Hello friends, welcome to a new lesson. In this video, we are going to learn Redux with React.js. If you have never used Redux before, don't worry because we'll cover the entire thing about Redux. We'll cover what it is, why it should be used, and how to use it in a React project, step by step. This video is sponsored by Simple Tools. Simple Tools is a collection of tools for developers which they use in their daily routine. For example, code beautifiers and minifiers, QR code generators, date time converters, data format converters, file converters, encoders and decoders, and much more. So, if you constantly find yourself searching for these tools online, do check out Simple Tools for one-stop solution for all these tools. Now, let's begin our tutorial. First of all, you need to understand why we need to use Redux with a library such as React. So, in React, you use something called state to manage the data in the application. Now, you can just use normal state in React if your data is very simple or less in quantity. As your React app grows, your state will become much more complex and needs to be used at many more places, right? So this can clutter your app and create very messy code if you just use React. So then you need to use something called Redux, which gives you two things. One, Redux creates a single source of truth, which basically means that all of your application state will now reside in one object called the Redux store. The Redux store will store this entire state of your application at one place. So all your components can refer to this store and find out the current state of your application. And that's why this Redux store is called a single source of truth. Second thing Redux gives you, it allows you to separate your UI code from your state management code. Unlike React, wherein the state code and the UI code are all in the same file, right? So here is a comparison between React and Redux. So when you are not using Redux, say that you have a chain of components. This is the parent component and these are its child components and so on. Now, when you need to pass some data from parent component, some state that is defined in the parent component to this child component, you need to pass it through all the middle child components as well, right? And if some child components need to update the state in the parent, it would need to pass that request further along the chain so that it finally leads to the parent components which can update that state. Now, with Redux, you don't need to pass that state down the child components because you get a store, a Redux store that stores all your state. So whichever component needs to access that state can directly refer to that to the store and get the data from the store without needing the data to be passed down across the chain of components. So that's how Redux makes it easy to manage state in a large React applications with a large number of components, right? Now, what exactly is Redux? So Redux is a tool which allows you to manage state in your application. A Redux store is based on three principles. The first one is single source of truth, which means all of your state will reside in one single store. Store is nothing but a simple object. So all your state resides in one object and every component will refer to this object to find out the current data. Second principle is that the Redux state in the Redux store is read-only. So components can only read the state in this Redux store. They cannot in any way update the state which is residing in the Redux store directly. In order to update the state in a Redux store, components need to emit actions. We will learn more about actions later in this lesson. The third principle of Redux is that the changes to the Redux state are made with functions called pure functions, which are known as reducers. So reducers in Redux are nothing but pure functions. If you don't know, a pure function is a function that for a given input returns a specific output, right? And so reducers are functions which can update the Redux state, and these functions need to be pure functions. So these are the three principles of Redux. Now, there are different parts in Redux or entities in Redux which you would need to know. First of all is the state. A state in Redux is nothing but an object, a JavaScript object that would hold all the state of your application like arrays, state variables, etc. Second is actions. Actions in Redux are events that your components will emit when they want to update some state which is stored in the Redux store. Third is reducers. Reducers, as I told you earlier, are nothing but pure functions which are able to update the Redux state. And finally, the store. The Redux store is the place where the state of your application lives inside, right? There is only one store in an application, which is the single source of truth. Now the workflow is that a component will emit an action to request updating of the Redux state. When an action is emitted, it is handled by a function called reducer. A reducer, depending on which action is emitted, updates the Redux state inside the Redux store. Once the state is updated inside the Redux store, the UI in React, which depends on that state, is re-rendered to reflect that change. Okay? Now that you know what is Redux and why you should use it, let's learn how to set it up in a project and actually start using it. So first of all, you need to create a new React project using the create React app command if you want. You can name it whatever you wish. Then you go into the directory and you start the server. Next step would be to install Redux in that directory, and you do that just by typing npm install Redux. You can specify the version number as well. In addition to Redux, you can also install a utility called React Redux. React Redux is a wrapper around Redux which offers some helper functions which makes it easier to use Redux compared to just plain Redux. Okay. Now, after you have installed Redux in your application, the next step for you, the first step to use Redux is to create a store. In order to create a store, go to your index.js file. Inside of your index.js file, you'll import create store from Redux. Using create store, you'll create a new store like this. This is how you create a new Redux store. But So the rest of the code in this file is what was generated with create react app command. Only these two lines are what you need to write to create a Redux store. Now, once you save this and try to run it, you'll see an error. And the error would be that a reducer function is expected. And this is because the create store function, which creates a new Redux store, requires a parameter. And that parameter is a reducer. Right? So next step is that you need to define a reducer. So in your index.js file, before defining the store, you define a reducer like this. So a reducer is nothing but a function. You can use the arrow function syntax, or you can use the function keyword if you prefer that. Now this reducer function will take two parameters. The first one is the state, and the second is the action. Now for this tutorial, the initial state is set to be a number 0. Usually in React applications, the initial state is an object. So you initialize your state with an empty object. For simplicity, we are just creating a store, a state variable that is a number, and initial value is 0. The second parameter is action, which will be an object. This function returns a state, right? So that's the characteristic of a reducer function, that is accepts state and action and returns a new state. After you have created this reducer function, you need to pass it to the create store function, and then your store will be created and the error will be gone, right? So the next thing is to verify that the store was created correctly. You can log to the console store.getState. A getState function is a function on the store object which allows you to access the current state stored inside the store, right? So when you log this to the console, this will log the number 0 because the state is only a number 0, right? Next step is to define an action or to handle an action inside the reducer, right? So now we modify our reducer function to handle a specific type of action. So to recap, the role of a reducer function is to update the state depending on the type of action that is emitted. So first of all, you need to check what is the type of action. To do that, you use an if clause and check for action.type. And this action.type can be any string that you want. In this case, we are checking if the action type is a string called increment. If it is a string called increment, then we must increment our state variable by 1. And so when this condition is true, we return a new state by incrementing the previous state by 1. And when this condition doesn't match, we return the existing state. So that's how you define a reducer function. Now, in other parts of your app, you need to retype this increment string again and again. To not do that, you can define an action object, right? Like this. So we call this increment action. And this action is nothing but an object. An action object will have two keys. One is called type, which defines the type of the object and is a string. The second key in an action object is a payload key. A payload key holds the data that the reducer function needs to access. For example, in case if instead of an increment action, you need to add a certain value to the existing state, then you will call the type to be add, and the payload key will be set to whichever value the user enters in an input box. For example, if a user enters 5, so the payload is set to 5, and so when the action type is add, the value, the action.payload value is added to the existing state, and then the resulting value is returned as a new state. Got it? If you have any doubts, feel free to ask in the comment section. So this is how you define an action. And do note, an action can have only two keys. One is type and the second is payload. Now, after you have defined the reducer function and an action, you can emit that action from some component. For example, app.js. Inside of app.js, in use effect or some button click, you can call store.dispatch. Now what store.dispatch does is it emits an action. The action it emits is the action you pass in as a parameter. And so here the action that we are passing as a parameter is the increment action. So when you write this code, what happens is it calls the reducer function and it passes the value of action to be of type increment. And so this code is run and the state variable is incremented by 1 and the value increases from 0 to 1. So this console statement before the store.dispatch is called, the value of store.getState, the current state of the store, will be 0. After this action is dispatched, the value of store.getState will be 1 because the state variable has been incremented. Okay. So the dispatch applies the action to the store so that the state is changed. Now you can do an exercise by trying to add a decrement action, right? So in order to do that, you'll create another if clause here and you'll check if the action.type is decrement. If it is, then you'll decrement a state by subtracting 1 from it, either by doing state equals to state minus 1 or by returning minus state, right? And then you will define a new action called decrement action, which type will be decrement. And then you can call or dispatch that action by passing decrement action to store.dispatch. Okay, so that's a homework for you. I have guided you on how to do that. Now that we have defined our store, we have created a reducer function and also an action. Next thing you can do is you can separate them out in their own respective files and folders. So first of all, create a store.js file in the source folder, right? Or in the same directory as your index.js file. And then shift the code to create the store in this file like this. And finally, you will export the store variable to the rest of your application. Okay. And you can also shift the reducer code to its own file. You can create a reducer folder and inside of that create an index.js file. And then place the reducer function inside of that file and finally export the reducer function. And then you can import the reducer function in your store.js like this and use it to create a store. Okay. And finally in your index.js file, you remove the code that you wrote earlier and just import your store like this. Okay. Now there is one more step on using this store which we'll see later. you can also refactor and put your actions code in an actions folder inside of an index.js file like this, and then export that action as well. And then wherever you need to call this action like app.js file, you'll import it like this. Okay. And similarly, you can define within this file itself, you can define the decrement action and export it as well. Now, inside your app.js, you can display on the UI the value of your current state variable like this. So you call store.getState, which will return the current state and display it inside a span like this. You can create a button, and on that button, whenever it is clicked, you call a callback function, and that callback function basically calls store.dispatch and passes the increment action, which means this plus button will increment the state by 1. Now, after you do increment it by 1, the state will be incremented, but you will not be able to see it on your screen. This is because you need to tell React to fetch updates to the Redux store. And you do that by importing the store in your index.js file, as we saw earlier, and then writing this line of code, which means you are subscribing to the store. And whenever the state in the store updates, the render function will be called, which means your UI in React will update whenever the Redux store updates its state. Okay, so now whenever you click the button plus, it will call the reducer function by emitting an increment action, and it will end up incrementing your state variable by 1, and that incremented variable, that new value, will then be rendered on your screen. Okay. Now you can try some new things, like you can create a child component to practice more with this code. Then you can place this child component inside of index.js, right? And you can pass a prop called onIncrement, which is nothing but a callback function that calls the increment action on store.dispatch. And within that child, you can place the plus button. And on click, you can pass the props.onIncrement. So basically, instead of placing the button in the parent component, you're creating a child component, and that button is placed there. And on click, the plus button will increment the state, right? So in this way, you don't need to pass state from one parent to another. The child can directly access the state from the global Redux store, right? So that's all for our Redux tutorial. In this lesson, you learned what is Redux, why it must be used, how to set it up in a React project, what are the entities of a Redux project, and how to write Redux code and use it to manage state in your React application. Now, all of this was just theory, although I have demonstrated it how to write code. But if you want to learn Redux with React by building a project, please let me know in the comments and like this video. If this video crosses 500 likes, I will create a new lesson in which I'll teach you how to build a project using Redux in React to manage state. So that's all for this lesson. If you liked, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thanks.